August 25th, 1944. Provence, France. 10 days after the Allied landings on the southern coast, the war no longer looked like victory. It looked like a road with no owner. Burned trucks sagged in ditches with their tires melted flat. Dead mules lay where artillery had opened them. A horse cart had been left in a vineyard lane with one wheel still turning in the wind. Men of the 36th Infantry Division moved through the wreckage with the practical habits of survivors. They checked pockets because dead men still carried useful things. They rolled bodies because the living still needed cigarettes, knives, maps, watches, or anything else that could be taken without paperwork. That morning, Private Dobbs turned over a dead German lieutenant and found two objects in the inner pocket of the tunic, a half-smoked cigar and a folded sheet of grease-stained paper. The cigar meant nothing. The paper did. It was a hand-drawn map. Not an official military chart, but the kind a man made for himself when he expected to come back. There was a farm marked Fondation Louis, a dry riverbed, a fork in a mule track, and one penciled German word in the margin: Warenlager, storage depot. The line work was clumsy in places, then suddenly precise at the turn-offs, as if the man who drew it had not cared about geography in the abstract, but cared very much about one destination. Dobbs brought it to Howard behind an abandoned farmhouse north of Marseille, where the company had halted for a few hours. Dobbs had already decided what the map meant. He was 30, broad-shouldered, quick-tempered, and more frightened of going home poor than of getting killed in France. He said no officer carried private coordinates for sacks of flour. He said that 2 nights earlier a French whore in a village wine shop had told him trucks went into the scrub near the Louis farm, and only half as many men came out. He said it with the confidence of a man who mistook desire for evidence. Howard did not answer at once. He was 45, old for an infantry private, and before the war he had chased oil and mineral rumors through Mexico and Venezuela. He knew what buried wealth did to small groups of men. It made them start calling greed by practical names. It made them say they were only protecting what they had found, only keeping what others would steal, only taking what war had already made ownerless. He studied the lines of the map, the nervous corrections in pencil, the way the route bent away from the farm itself toward the hard country behind it. He said only that things buried in a hurry were usually meant to be dug up in a greater hurry. That was enough. Dobbs heard permission in it. The cost, though not yet visible, was that the one man in the group who understood where such trails ended had now agreed to follow one. The third man was Corporal Curtin, 22, a farm boy from Ohio who had been in uniform long enough to look dirty, but not long enough to lose his innocence cleanly. He had not yet learned that shame and necessity often wore the same face in war. Dobbs told him the army would send him home with nothing but a pair of bad knees and a cheap handshake, while one share of hidden German gold could buy land, a garage, a future. Curtin watched Howard before he answered. That was the important part. He was not persuaded by the logic. He was persuaded by the fact that the oldest man present did not crush it. When Howard did not kill the idea, Curtin stepped in. The fourth was Staff Sergeant Erich Fuhrmann, a company clerk who spoke fluent German and French. He was a Jew from Vienna, useful to everyone and trusted by no one. He took the map, read the word in the margin, and said storage depot did not have to mean treasure. It could mean ammunition, documents, black market food, looted silver, anything. But he also admitted what mattered. Without him, the map remained a rumor. With him, it became directions. He copied the names twice, once carefully and once in a quicker shorthand of his own, and Howard noticed the tension in his mouth. Fuhrmann did not look excited. He looked like a man who had just realized that information could turn him into both guide and hostage. The 36th Division had been pushing hard through southern France. Men were tired, units were scattered, discipline had loosened in the way it always did when roads were crowded and officers had too much ground and too few hours. Howard knew desertion almost never began with speeches. It began with a calculation. One missing rifle, one missing jeep, one dark road, one dawn too far from camp to turn back. By dusk, the four of them had made that calculation. Dobbs stole a jeep during a shift change. Howard gathered rations, canteens, an entrenching tool, and the weapons least likely to be missed before daylight. Curtin kept watch. Fuhrman copied the key words from the map onto a scrap he could destroy if necessary. The result was a plan. The cost was that once the jeep rolled into the dark, they were no longer merely tempted men. They were armed deserters. They drove north through villages already between masters. French flags had begun to reappear, but so had burned lorries, looted shops, and bodies nobody had yet had time to bury. In one square, a bell tower still stood above houses that had lost their roofs. In another, a woman was sweeping glass out of a doorway, while two dead Germans lay beneath a wall chalked with tricolour paint. The farther they went from the coast, the less the land seemed governed by anyone at all. Howard watched moonlight strike stone, scrub, and broken walls, and thought of all the dime novel fools riding toward hills because someone had whispered gold. The only difference, he decided, was that these horses ran on gasoline. At dawn, they left the road and entered the hard country at the edge of the Alpine foothills. Provence, in late summer, was all glare, thorn, and limestone. The farm from the map appeared by mid-morning, half ruined and recently used. There were tire marks near the shed, ration tins in the dirt, a wall chipped by fragments, and a smell of old manure mixed with cordite. The farm told them the map had not lied. It did not tell them where to dig. That was where Howard became indispensable. Bombing had torn up the terrain. A map drawn before the shelling no longer matched what the eye saw. Howard moved through the ground with the patience of a prospector. Water disturbed stone one way, men another. A crater scattered rock outward. A concealed excavation left a different disorder behind. Fuhrman found the remains of a temporary German sign, half swallowed by thorn, enough lettering left to confirm that vehicles had once been routed through the area. Howard found stones in a dry channel that had been lifted and replaced by hand. Curtin found places where brush had been cut and then laid back to look untouched. The result was that land and paper began to agree. The cost was that every hour of searching left tracks of their own. War returned before the gold did. Near noon, two German stragglers rose out of a fold in the ground, starving, filthy, and exhausted. Their rifles came halfway up and then stopped there. Dobbs raised his own weapon at once and said the safest thing was to kill them. Howard stepped in front of the muzzle. Fuhrman spoke to the Germans in quick, level German, ordering them to drop their arms and back away. Curtin watched Dobbs instead of the prisoners and saw something that unsettled him more than fear would have. Dobbs looked ready. Not ready to defend himself. Ready to begin. In the end, they took the Germans' weapons and let them go north on foot. The decision spared two enemy lives. It also opened the first crack inside the group. Dobbs filed the moment away as weakness. Curtin saw how little stood between argument and execution. Howard preserved the last rule that still allowed him to think he was not yet a bandit. Somewhere in the hills, two men went on living with a memory of armed Americans moving through the scrub with purpose. They searched the rest of the day and camped without a fire in a basin of stone and scrub oak. Nobody wanted to say openly that the Germans might come back. Nobody wanted to say that the greater danger already lay inside the circle. Dobbs cleaned his rifle with too much care. Fuhrman smoked in silence. Curtin pretended he was merely tired. Howard listened to the insects and the shifting of blankets and knew the first lie of any treasure hunt was always the same. Men claimed they were sharing risk, when what they were really sharing was delay. The second day narrowed the field. Fuhrman found an SS ring in a crack of white rock. Howard saw that part of the dry riverbed had been disturbed, not by water or blast, but by labor. Then Curtin, moving upstream along the edge of a juniper stand, kicked something metal. The sound was wrong for that place. They cleared gravel and root until the shape of a rusted iron plate emerged. When they levered it up, a pocket of cold air rose out of the opening below. They found the bodies first. 3 Germans, boots on, sidearms gone, each shot in the back of the head. Execution, not battle. Behind them stood 6 canvas sacks. Dobbs cut the cord on the nearest one. Gold spilled into the light in a dull, heavy slide. Dust, clipped bars, chains, crushed settings, fragments of ornaments torn from larger forms. One piece still held the broken branches of a menorah. Another held half a wedding inscription, the letters twisted by force. The bags did not look like military payroll. They looked like the smashed portable remains of many houses and many hands. No one cheered. That silence mattered more than any shout would have. If men stumbled onto luck, they laughed. If they opened a hole in the earth and found the packed remains of looting and murder, they went quiet. Fuhrman stared at the menorah fragment and turned away. Dobbs did the opposite. The moment silence ended, he began talking about weight, transport, and shares. Howard listened and understood that until now they had only been walking toward trouble. Now they were carrying it. They took the sacks out in stages and hid them in brush above the cave while they argued. No one seriously suggested reporting the cash. That option died without needing words. By the time a man says he should surrender treasure, he has usually already imagined spending it. Dobbs proposed they move north, avoid the road, and divide everything once they reached friendly lines. Howard agreed to moving north, but not to division. He knew too well that counting started killings. Dobbs smiled as if the discussion could be postponed. It could only be postponed because they had not yet started counting. By late afternoon, he offered the proposal that turned fear into a system. Each man, he said, should take a small private portion from the common sacks in case they were separated or forced to abandon the main load. It sounded prudent because it was partly true. Howard refused at once. Gold, he said, must never be split too early. Once men counted private portions, they began comparing. Once they compared, one of them would decide somebody else had carried less, risked less, deserved less. Curtin heard the warning and still looked at the sacks. Dobbs pressed him. Did he want his future tied to another man's honesty? Curtin hesitated, then sided with Dobbs. Fuhrman said nothing, which in that moment was almost another vote. They made the private packets. The result was security, on paper. The cost was that from then on, every man slept beside both a common hoard and a secret hoard. And the secret mattered more. The change showed itself at once. Men carrying hidden gold touched their jackets without meaning to. They shifted positions on the trail, so no one stayed too long at the rear. They woke faster. They watched one another's hands. Dobbs began speaking less like a partner and more like a bookkeeper. Fuhrman withdrew further into himself. Once, when Dobbs joked about whatever family had once owned the smashed menorah, Fuhrman gave him a look so cold that even Dobbs let the silence stand. Howard noticed another alteration as well. No one any longer spoke about getting back to camp. They spoke only about getting through the hills, as if the army had already become a previous life. Howard altered the route north, away from the line by which they had come. He said retracing steps made pursuit easy. That was true, but not the whole truth. He no longer trusted the straightforward path, because the straightforward path led back through the place where they had let 2 Germans walk away alive. They moved through dry washes and thorn corridors, carrying the sacks in rotation. The bigger bags stayed common. The smaller hidden portions rode in private pockets like bad thoughts. By the end of the second night after the cave, the group no longer behaved like deserters with a shared objective. They behaved like four men temporarily delaying an inheritance dispute. Sometime after midnight, Curtin woke and felt at once that something was missing. He looked toward Fuhrman's blanket and saw a shape made from rolled gear. He rose quietly and followed the faint scrape of a boot over stone. Behind a boulder on the edge of camp, he saw Fuhrman in silhouette, speaking low in German to someone hidden by the angle of rock. Curtin could not hear the words. That mattered. Men often commit worse acts over incomplete knowledge than over hard fact. He saw only secrecy, German speech, and a figure outside the circle. Then he backed away before he was seen. On the way back, he stood for a moment in the dark between Howard's blanket and Dobbs's, deciding which man to trust. By the time he touched Dobbs's shoulder, the choice had already done its damage. Dobbs did not ask whether Curtin might have misunderstood. He did not propose waiting, confronting Fuhrman in the morning, or letting Howard hear the account first. He accepted the report with the speed of a man receiving a reason he had been waiting for. Morning came hot and white. They broke camp and moved out in silence, the sacks redistributed, the rifles close. Howard could feel the wrongness without yet seeing its shape. Dobbs lagged with Fuhrman whenever the trail narrowed. Curtin would not meet Howard's eyes. Then, on a stretch of broken stone above another dry channel, one pistol shot cracked behind them. Fuhrman fell before he could speak. Dobbs stood a few paces away with the pistol still up and said the words he had prepared for himself during the night. Fuhrman had been bringing Germans onto them. He had heard enough to know it. There had been no time to wait. Howard looked at Fuhrman's body, then at Dobbs's face, and understood what mattered. Perhaps Fuhrman had spoken to one of the released Germans. Perhaps he had tried to bargain, misdirect, or warn. None of that explained why Dobbs had shot him from behind at close range. This was not a battlefield decision. This was arithmetic with a weapon. Howard did not challenge him. It was the hardest silence of the journey and the most deliberate. He crouched, took the small packet of gold hidden in Fuhrman's jacket and handed it to Dobbs. Then he told Curtin to fetch the entrenching tool. He was not conceding the truth of the accusation. He was buying time with metal. If he reached for justice in that moment, there would be 2 more bodies before noon. The result was survival. The cost was that he let murder set the rules. They buried Fuhrman in shallow soil between stones because deeper digging meant more time beside him than any of them could bear. Dobbs smoked while the dirt went over the uniform. Curtin worked like a man trying not to look at the face he was covering. No one prayed. No one repeated Fuhrman's name once the earth covered him. That omission mattered as much as the shallow grave. A man not named quickly becomes an inconvenience rather than a dead companion. Howard noted the place only in his head, the line of 2 stones and a twisted root, and understood even that act was useless. Memory was all the marker Fuhrman was going to get. The 3 who remained moved north under a routine that looked efficient from the outside and diseased from within. One man carried a sack for an hour, while the other 2 walked armed beside him. Then they rotated. Dobbs calculated out loud. What could a man buy with his share in Ohio? How much land? How much fuel? How much labor? The questions were not talk. They were a way of measuring how valuable Curtin and Howard might become if dead. Howard answered little. He had entered the last stage of the expedition, the stage in which everybody knew what was coming and pretended not to. Late that day, Curtin tried to draw closer to him on the trail. Howard let him come near enough to hear a whisper. When they slept, Curtin was not to lie between him and Dobbs. Curtin nodded once, and the look in his face changed. Until then, he had been frightened of events. Now he became frightened of a specific man in a specific coming night. They reached an abandoned shepherd's hut at dusk. a square stone shell with a broken roof, and one doorway opening into blackness. It offered what all bad refuges offered, just enough shelter to make murder easier. Howard studied the walls, the floor, and the cracked seam in the rear masonry. Dobbs volunteered for first watch. Under ordinary conditions, it might have sounded generous. Under these conditions, it sounded like scheduling. Howard lay in the dark and listened to Dobbs' boots shift outside the doorway. Then he touched Curtin's shoulder and pointed toward the split in the rear wall. They crawled through one at a time, leaving the sacks where they lay. To carry them out that way would have meant noise and delay, and Howard finally understood that any plan preserving both the gold and their lives belonged to a world that no longer existed. They slid into the darkness behind the hut and made their way toward a stand of olive trees. From 20 yards off, Howard called softly back and offered the last arrangement left. Dobbs could take the larger share and go his own way. Howard and Curtin would keep only what they already carried and disappear. It was a practical proposal. That was why it failed. If Howard and Curtin lived, then Fuhrman's death remained murder witnessed by others. Dobbs shouted back that nobody could cross those hills without water, roads, or bearings. The words were partly true. The truth under them was simpler. He could not permit witnesses to survive. The result was that any final pretense of partnership ended before a shot was fired. The first shots came not from the hut, but from the ridge above it. Muzzle flashes blinked through the dark brush, and bullets tore stone from the doorway. Dobbs turned toward the sound, and a round hit him high in the chest, slamming him back against the sacks. More grey figures came down the slope, broken by scrub and darkness. Howard recognized one by shape even before the man shouted. It was one of the Germans they had disarmed and released. That recognition completed the chain Howard had felt tightening since the first day. Mercy alone had not killed them. Neither had greed alone. But the released Germans, the trail of tracks through the scrub, the delay caused by hauling wealth, and the fracture inside the group had all converged on the same patch of ground. They had spent days building the perfect conditions for an ambush, and then obligingly supplied the motive. Howard seized Curtin's sleeve and dragged him downslope through the olives toward the dry riverbed below. Once outside, gunfire enters a private quarrel. Every unfinished argument becomes a luxury. They had nearly reached the channel when Curtin cried out and collapsed. A bullet had passed through the muscle of his upper thigh. It was not a heroic wound, only a wet ruin that made him dead weight in an instant. Howard pulled him behind a bank of stone and waited for more shots. Instead, he heard shouting in German behind them, then ragged gunfire from several directions at once. The men from the ridge had found the sacks. They were doing in minutes what Howard's own party had spent days preparing to do. Gold made mirrors of everyone. The result was a gap in the chaos. The cost was that Curtin now weighed more than any sack, and Howard still had his own hidden packet of gold dust tied inside his jacket. He bound the wound as hard as he could and dragged Curtin into the dry channel. The bed was a shifting field of stone that tore at knees and palms. Howard moved by inches, then feet. Behind them the shooting flared, then thinned, then stopped. He did not look back. He had reached the point where knowledge no longer offered advantage. Every few yards, the packet in his jacket knocked against his ribs. It had become unbearable, not because it was heavy, but because it still pretended to be useful. At a muddy trickle where the channel held a little water, he stopped. Curtin's face had gone grey with blood loss and fever. Howard untied his jacket, took out the packet, and weighed it in his palm for 1 second. In another life, it might have meant a business, a house, a second start. In this one, it meant only that he had carried part of the same corruption he blamed in others. He opened his hand over the stream. The gold fell into brown water, flashed once through silt, and vanished. A few bubbles rose and broke. Nothing in the world announced that a man had just surrendered the thing he had crossed 3 moral lines to reach. Then he dragged Curtin on. Around midday they were found by a French resistance patrol moving through the area with captured German carbines and improvised armbands. Howard's first feeling was calculation, not relief. In southern France that month, armed Frenchmen without regular uniforms could be patriots, avengers, opportunists, or some mixture of all three. But they saw a wounded American and an older one hauling him and decided to help. Howard gave them only the truth required to secure water and a litter. German contact in the hills, an ambush, missing men. He omitted the cave, the sacks, Fuhrmann, and the packet now lying in the streambed mud. The result was rescue. The cost was that what mattered most could never be reported, without reporting himself. Curtin lived. The bullet missed the artery, though the leg never healed cleanly. Years later in Ohio, he would stand behind the counter of a filling station with a cane never far away, and children who knew their father disliked summer insects for reasons he never explained. He would marry, pay bills, talk about gasoline prices, and still wake in August hearing one pistol shot in dry country. That was survival in the practical American sense. Work, marriage, roof, pain managed, but not erased. Howard survived longer, though not more cleanly. He made it through the rest of the war, through the paperwork after it, through the long civilian years in which memory does not fade so much as change its habits. He died in 1968 of cancer. But the hardest thing Provence left him was not fear, it was precision. He had not shot Fuhrmann. He had not first proposed desertion. He had not raised the rifle in the shepherd's hut. Yet he had approved the journey, carried the sacks, submitted to private division, and bought his last hours of safety by handing a dead man's hidden gold to his killer. That arithmetic never left him. He never learned what became of the treasure. Perhaps the surviving Germans carried it north and died with it. Perhaps a French patrol found the site later. Perhaps some of it still lies in stone and mud, no richer for the men who died near it. The uncertainty suited the truth better than any neat ending would have. Gold did not set anyone free that summer. It only changed the shape of the cage. What Howard finally understood was simple enough. War creates places where ownership collapses before order returns. In such places, men begin to treat abandoned objects as invitations. A watch on a corpse, a jeep in the dark, a map in a dead lieutenant's pocket, a cave filled with looted bullion. Each looks ownerless for just long enough to make theft resemble freedom. That resemblance killed Fuhrmann, killed Dobbs, crippled Curtin, and followed Howard for the rest of his life. When Howard looked back, he never thought the disaster truly began in the cave. It began when Dobbs unfolded that grease-stained map beside the half-smoked cigar, and 4 tired Americans mistook a dead man's unfinished business for a path out of war. Everything after that was only the proper cost of unfolding it